Welcome, everybody. It's time for another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. I'm Phil, along with John and special guest Dillon today, back to the show for a little episode here. We're recording this on Halloween to be launched on November the 1st. So welcome, everybody, to a new month.
I'm scared.
Yep. It's episode 212. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about making projects on site, preparing for TV shows, and designing around plywood, as well as addressing a few listener comments. Today's episode is brought to you by Grizzly Industrial, purveyors of fine woodworking machinery since 1983. Buy direct and save at grizzly.com. All right. Just a handful of comments. Wooden Things and Stuff says, as another guy who has people on the internet watching him and making things and listening to him talk about making things, I totally get it. It's weird. But I try to remember that I do that too and appreciate the people I watch. So I like to think I'm appreciated too, and that feels nice, but weird, but also nice. Mm. Also, I'm with Phil on the bandsaw blade changes. I change the blade when it tells me I should have changed it a few cuts ago. T.G. Aikens says, time for another shop or a barn on Logan's land. And I feel like that's always a possibility.
Yeah. He needs some storage. He needs a storage unit or something. He's just run out of room.
Right. I mean, the theme of the episode, just to bring Dillon up to speed, was the episode was called "Why Are You Listening to Our Conversation?" So,
why are we listening to what?
Our conversation.
Yeah. Why are people listening to us? It's weird.
Yeah,
it's kind of creepy.
Because there's nothing else on.
Yeah, apparently.
Puppy Doc says, why do I listen? It's oddly entertaining. The question is, which of us is odd? The bigger question, why do I go back and re-listen to some episodes?
Wow.
Actually, meeting the crew has really brought the entertainment value to a new level. I have a different level of appreciation for your personalities, sense of humor, etc. And the topics are often very helpful. Keep up the great work.
Mm-hmm. You know what's really odd is, like, a lot of times I'll be setting up the podcast to go up on YouTube. So I'll start listening to the beginning so I can remember what we talked about and put in the description and stuff. And I'll end up just letting it play and, like, listening to, because a lot of stuff I don't even remember. So it's like next day I'm re-listening to it like some kind of weirdo.
You go into some sort of trance.
Yeah. It's just us.
I'm glad to hear you say that, John, because that's happened to me on more than one occasion where listening, which is weird because I do reviews of TV show episodes, and that is different to me because it's like, oh, gross. I just hate listening to myself and seeing myself and watching for stuff. But sometimes you're exactly right. On the podcast, you're just living it in the moment. And then by the time you get through with it, it's kind of like, and then you hear it again and it's all brand new. It's totally fresh.
Yep.
I sort of remember talking about this, but didn't realize we did that for a podcast. But we did. So, another comment here from BOY9GGZ says, where can I find a video tour of Logan's shop? Every week he has a new tool, and it would be nice to see how he has organized them in his new space. Mm-hmm. The short answer is that Craig Toole came down with a film crew and did a shop tour at Logan's place. And I think they just recently published that on their YouTube channel. So I will put a link to that in the show notes page for you to see that, because it would be really weird to have everybody go see Logan's shop, but it is a fun place to be. And it is a little bit like, I feel like it's the back cover of a highlights magazine where you need to, like, every time you enter his shop, Logan hands you a little sheet that says, you need to find these 12 things. And it's just weird random stuff.
But yeah, he could do a shop tour every week because it's a different shop. There's new things all the time.
Yes. Yeah. Jeff Yantha says, sounds like Goose needs a wingman. I don't think you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to see once. It depends on what the mice situation looks like as we get farther and colder here into the season.
I think technically Logan is his wingman sometimes because I've heard rumblings of Logan sleeping in his office. So,
yeah.
Yes, that would be interesting to see if that's in the tour because Logan's office technically has just a cot in it and Goose's bed. So who knows? And then Alfredo 158, says, since we've become the Transformers Shopsmith Cat Fancy podcast, which I have absolutely no problem with,
mm-hmm.
y'all might check out an episode of a program on another streaming service called The Toys That Made Us. The episode about the Transformers was a lot of fun, especially when they had when the voice artist who does Optimus Prime explain his motivation and inspiration.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. Peter Cullen is that voice artist, and I do love his voice, especially when he's in Optimus Prime mode. So anyway, I want to have a range of things that I want to talk about today. One of those is for you, John, in the sense that next week we start filming season 19 of the TV show, which has a little Back to the Future aspect to it because these episodes won't air until September 2025.
Mm-hmm. Nearly a year from now.
Yeah.
Which will seem like 5 years.
Right. Yeah, because we'll go back and then we'll watch episode 1 and it'll be like, that was for this season?
Right. Why is it in black and white?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you are kind of hip deep in preparing some of the parts for that. The first episode is going to be a sideboard that Chris designed for the magazine. So I would love it if you could kind of walk us through the process of how you get stuff ready for an episode. Because we have a lot of people that ask, like, how long does it take to film an episode? And the answer always has like a couple of asterisks on it because there's a lot that goes on before and after the filming that stretches that out. So you wouldn't mind just running through what you do.
Yep. So I kind of like that we're starting episode 1 of this season with, I mean, it's not necessarily a weekend project, but it's not overly complicated and it's all made from alder. So I can kind of work up to mid-season form. It's not real heavy wood or anything. So can kind of build up my endurance, you know, and then taper off towards the end of the season. But so this project's all solid wood. So some of the projects we do are more plywood or jigs and that kind of thing. So with this one, there's a lot of preparing stock from rough lumber or gluing up panels because that's not something we usually want to see on camera. It's kind of tedious. So a lot of just breaking down lumber, getting stuff glued up so it's ready to get planed down ahead of time and kind of get the parts in rough shape. And then, I don't know. It used to be that, and this was before we moved up here in our old studio, the way we would shoot things is we'd end up with probably 2.5 finished projects just because we'd get like case parts glued up or doors all glued up. But it seems like we can work with the camera crew and quick enough that we don't need to do that. So we just end up with one basically one finished project. But yeah, a lot of, for the solid wood projects, making sure panels are glued up and cut to shape, and doors and drawers are usually fit to the case, so I can't make those ahead of time, but I can get, rough size parts, and then as we get the case assembled, we can start cutting, parts to fit that case. So it's kind of a process of get as much done ahead of time and then kind of sprint to keep up with as we're filming. Kind of like, okay, I got this done, now quickly make this to fit, but just make sure I have the rough parts kind of ready to go, I guess.
Yeah. Now, we had a customer service question, I think, come in earlier this week where somebody was asking about how much material to purchase. They had to order their lumber through a place much like we do at Liberty, where it's not like you can go there with a piece of chalk and a tape measure and start pulling out boards and sort of rough marking things out. You have to just order your boards, and you kind of get what you get. So when you're ordering, especially for this one, since it's a solid wood piece, when you ordered the material for this project, what was your strategy there?
So with pretty much all of our projects in Woodsmith, we have a nice, cute little cutting diagram that we have all these magical sized boards, and then you'll cut all the pieces. This is how you cut all the pieces from those magical boards, and it'll just come out perfect, and there'll be no defects or knots or waste or anything. But that is not the case in real life. So I usually take that cutting diagram, and it'll give the board feet for approximately what you'll need, and then I add maybe 30 to 50% depending on what type of wood I'm getting. Like alder usually has more knots and defects in it, and it's like, if that's not the look we were wanting to go with, I'll order a little extra, knowing that I have to cut around that. And also depending on if it's a project that has a lot of longer pieces, and I don't know if I'm going to get 8-foot boards or 12-foot boards or 10-foot board, like what I'm going to get out of that, I kind of have to, play with that a little bit. Like if I need to get 4-foot pieces out of a board, and I think I'm going to get 8-foot boards, I'm probably not going to get 2 clean 4-foot lengths out of it. But if I got 10-foot boards, I would. So it's kind of a guessing game there as far as that's concerned. So getting the 30 to 50% extra always kind of accounts for that. So we can usually make it work.
Yeah. Dillon, you kind of play this game too in designing projects and then ordering material for Mark and Steve through Liberty. And let's just we're not trying to criticize Liberty. It's just the nature of their business model that you're just ordering boards. What do you have what's our relationship with them in terms of, can we say like, hey, we're looking for wide boards, long boards, a certain thickness, that kind of thing? What kind of things have you talked to them about when you're ordering in order to make sure we get what we want?
Yeah, well, so typically you'll know going into it, what quarter you want to work with. So what your final thickness dimensions of your parts will be. So, it could be that you want X amount of 4/4, you need X amount of 6 or 8/4 for legs, depending again on what piece you're working on. But outside of that, Liberty does, and again, not to pick on them, but just since we're talking about them, if you do in fact need wider boards, you can specify that, hey, look, I want to get a couple legs out of a board. Could I, get stuff that's over 6 inches wide? Can I get a board that's over 8 inches wide? If you get much wider than that, it just kind of depends on the species. I think back to kind of what John said too, in terms of, the quantity that you want to order. The quality of the wood is typically good, but without looking at it, I think that is the big determiner for me about how much more I'm going to order and the species of wood. So, stuff like cherry and alder, like he talked about or mentioned, I'm probably going to be ordering more at the 50% threshold just because of the sapwood and or knots and imperfections.
Okay.
Even walnut sometimes. I know that's difficult when you're building projects for yourself or for someone else versus, doing it as an actual job where, you want to quote people the appropriate amount, but you don't want to, up front, people typically have sticker shock when it comes to materials. And you don't want to order more than, that you're willing to pay for, and you don't want waste. We don't really consider it waste here because we'll just integrate it into another project, whether it be small or big. And so a lot of times too, we'll just go ahead and hit that 50% or higher threshold with extra material just to account for, again, imperfections, sapwood and that sort of thing. But if you are working with a source that you are not allowed to hand pick or cherry pick your boards, I would always, aim for that higher percentage. And again, whatever sort of relationship you have with your retailer, a lot of times I think that they're willing to, if you need a certain length, you need boards that are over 10 feet long or 8 feet or whatever the number is. Same with the actual width too. So those are just a lot of the, I think, factors that you need to think about going into it that, in an ideal world, of course, you would order the exact amount you need, with the exception of accounting for the kerf of your cuts, but you really don't know how many cuts you're going to be making. Realistically, you could probably get it close, but that's hardly ever the case. And so I think it's just something that's been kind of a working model for us because we do it a lot. So we kind of have a good idea of how we want to calculate board feet. But again, I think back to your original point, Phil, usually suppliers are typically willing to, again, if you have minor specifications, that they'll do that, but they don't want to spend all day obviously rifling through a pile of wood when the stuff comes in as bundles anyway. So but I think they're willing to be lenient, again, if you have minor stipulations.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was wondering is like how, and it probably depends retailer to retailer, what kind of, how much can you go in saying like, hey, I'm making this and I really need something, like say, well, for the sideboard, we need some material for a glued up top, and that's sort of the showpiece surface. Mm-hmm. So we need X amount that looks really cool. And, or if you were, say you were working with quarter sawn white oak, feels like you would probably want to, in spite of the fact that it's more expensive, order a little bit more in order to be able to pick the best grain patterns out of all of it.
Well, the type of cut too will really dictate that. I mean, you're not going to get a quarter sawn board that's probably much wider, than just throwing random number out there. Like 8 to 10 inches seems, not that it can't happen. It's just, it's probably unlikely if you're getting it from a big supplier. So you're going to have to think in terms of boards that you're going to get that are less than 6 inches wide. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The other thing is when you're working with, say, cherry or alder or walnut, and you're ordering plain sawn material, but you want like drawer fronts or door like to have really straight grain, and you're kind of picking grain, like, so you have to really cut around a board and get creative. So it's not like you're just throwing the board on the table saw and cutting strips. You're kind of being choosy about what grain patterns and where you're picking stuff from the board, and or how you're gluing up panels and mixing and matching that way. So
yeah, because like you said, Dillon, woodworkers I think are a little thrifty by nature, and we kind of want to use everything but the squeal on a board. And but instead I think you have to be a little bit more strategic. Like, this board has some knots in it or some sapwood, but maybe that's okay because that can be the stiles and rails for the back panel assembly, or like this sideboard has a showpiece top and then like a suspended case. Well, maybe the bottom of the case can have some of the less desirable pieces, and you're still getting value out of them, even though they're not necessarily prime.
Or if you can hide a defect under a top, like on the underside of a top where it's not going to show, or the underside of the case, or, kind of work around things that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I had that in the sideboard that I built for my sister, and then we did a version of it for the TV show. The material that I got purchased it from Logan, and just the nature of the boards that were available, there were quite a few pieces in walnut that had a lot of sapwood in. And at first it feels like that's just a lot of waste. But then the way they were laid out, I could turn those into drawer fronts. So then all the drawer fronts then could incorporate little bits of sapwood, and that becomes an intentional choice in the construction of the project. As the ancients used to say, turning a problem into a friend. So,
well, it's amazing how much of that stuff comes up with, and you contend with after you've already purchased the wood. You have such a set plan going into it. There's a lot of things that you kind of have to make decisions on the fly, which is kind of woodworking in a nutshell, anyway.
Yeah. Today's episode is brought to you by Grizzly Industrial, purveyors of fine woodworking machinery since 1983. Buy direct and save at grizzly.com. Yeah. And I think there's also room for improvisation in sizing pieces too, where, say you have something that you would, to John's earlier example, you want something that's 4 feet long for whatever. And depending on the board you get, maybe you can't get 2 4-foot pieces out of it, but can you get 2 46-inch pieces out of it? And is that going to still serve the purpose that it needs to? Mm-hmm. And really a 2-inch difference may or may not matter on that.
Yeah, there are times that when I've been building stuff for the show where it's like, oh, maybe if I just cut the sides a 1/2 inch narrower and we just make this a little bit smaller, and, I can cut off some of the imperfections, and this is all I can get out of, these pieces. It's fine. Change a little bit. It's just like the lines on the road. The dimensions are merely suggestions.
Right. Okay. Well, let's flip this around a little bit in the sense that, Dillon, you've kind of been in a little bit of a plywood mode for some of your project designs recently. And not only that, but kind of shop projects and plywood.
Yeah.
So there's some challenges there, because it seems like it's tough to make plywood look different from piece to piece, and yet you've done that. So what were some of the things that you've gone through on your recent projects here?
I almost feel like in some ways I'm just being typecasted, and now I realize this is why I'm here. So, no, that is true. I mean, not even stuff with the magazine, but a lot of the projects I've been working on outside of the magazine have also been plywood projects, or projects made from plywood, I should say. One, I think it just proposes an interesting challenge. I think that's probably I think that's what the magic is for me, about thinking about projects in terms of a preset scale and, dimension of a sheet of plywood, and kind of back to the point of, maybe wanting a 4-foot top, and like, what's a couple inches if, I can utilize an entire board versus having to get a whole new piece. Well, I think about that in terms of the plywood a lot too, where I have clients that, they want something that's one dimension, but it's like, well, hey, we could get two of these out of one if you just sacrifice, an extra like 3/4 of an inch, and we could get a full sheet. And so I just like thinking of those terms about maximizing material. But to the projects we've been doing here, a lot of the shop projects we do inevitably end up being, Baltic birch plywood. I know as recently we started to use some, I believe it's like sanded pine plywood you would just get at a home improvement store. It's a lot less expensive. It's far more accessible than Baltic birch plywood too. So, and that's another thing that kind of not only inspires projects, but for us, we want people to feel like what is represented is something that they feel like they not only could build, but it's materials that they know they can get. Because I'm sure there's people out there that might see a project built out of Baltic birch plywood and just think, well, I can't get that. I'm not going to build that, And so I think it is important to represent stuff that is readily available. And that certainly inspires a lot of our projects. But outside of, working with just a 5x5 or a 4x sheet of plywood, I like the idea of changing the look and kind of the perception of plywood and thinking in terms of, shop projects as just, shop furniture or furniture for your shop. So it doesn't have to look like something super static that's just serving a utilitarian purpose, which is great and valid, but something that could easily be spotted, just because there's a drill press on it in a shop, it couldn't, serve as, something else in a home. And that kind of idea or dichotomy really interests me. And so I've been kind of going through the process of, I wouldn't really say manipulating, because I'm not really changing the form of the plywood, but there are certain applications or treatments I'm doing to it, and then just working within, very like geometric shapes and kind of just changing the look of these projects to make them not look like plywood, but just maybe looking at plywood in a little bit different way. So,
yeah, because we have there's a 3-part shop work center storage system that we have that'll be in this next issue of ShopNotes that uses that, I don't know, BC plywood, kind of sanded pine. And part of the thing that I noticed in that is the construction model, in terms of that you're just basically cutting parts together and then using strategically placed pocket screws or air-fired brad nails and diagonal bracing and that kind of thing to create something that not only is structurally sound, but has a specific look going for it too.
Yeah, that piece in particular, and there's a little, to me, it seems part of the color scheme kind of bled over from a previous kind of suite of furniture that I'm sure there's still another piece we'll add to it at some point, but I think it was a child's armoire, and then I think I did a dresser that went with it too. And there's this, particular shade of blue that for whatever reason just keeps on finding its way into some of the pieces I did. But that project in particular, again, the material really easy to get, really affordable. The construction of it, like you said, is mostly pin nails and pocket screws. I think Mark actually used a track saw to cut a lot of the parts. So if you're someone that doesn't have a table saw, you could use a chop saw to cut smaller pieces, and then a track saw to cut or rip the bigger sheets. I really like the idea of kind of taking like the positive and negative forms and seeing how I could apply that to each piece and kind of tie them together so they seem like they belong together. And then the paint had, a part in that as well, where as anyone will see when it finally comes out, that it's maybe not painted in the most traditional way or how you would maybe originally would think to paint it. And that's just, again, one of the ways that I like thinking about projects and treating, something as an industrial and readily available as plywood. So it's what keeps me interested, I should say.
Right. Going back to an earlier point is, we have several competing interests when we're putting together project plans for the magazine, in something that, we're looking at the complexity of the construction, the usefulness of the project, if there are any specific techniques or something that we can pull out for another type of article. But to be honest, some of our choices in materials and design is driven by what the photography needs to look like in the magazine or in the plan to be eye-catching and inspirational. So I think that's one of the reasons that we use Baltic birch a lot too, is because, we want that project to look its best for photos.
Yeah. It's nothing personal. It's just something that we feel like we need to do. But, and then again, for us, it is something that, we default to, like a lot of us default to certain things. It's like we discovered it, like we discovered fire. And so we just default to using it because it's readily available to us, and I think to your point of it being something that photographs well, it looks aesthetically pleasing on its own, but it's incredibly structurally sound and stable, and sinking screws in it is great. So again, it's kind of checking all these boxes for us, but it's something that we do from time to time, I think, need to get away from and start thinking about other sheet good materials that can be integrated into, shop projects or even, furniture projects that, will live in your home. So, but I think that's just kind of part of staying like interested and intrigued and inspired by, newer technologies of, plywood hasn't changed a whole lot, I think somewhat recently, but trust me, there's definitely sheet goods out there that I probably haven't heard of and certainly haven't used and want to start considering those for applications in the future.
Yeah. And editorially, since I'm writing a lot of these projects, I think it would be helpful for us to admit that there are some projects where the qualities of Baltic birch are important, in terms of flatness or consistency or something like that. But then there's other times where we've chosen it for aesthetic reasons, and that you can definitely go with plain birch plywood or something along those lines. One material that I've noticed you using, Dillon, is, and I don't even know what to call it, because instead of being like your typical plywood, which has, birch, pine, whatever hardwood veneer over the top of it, this has a layer of, I don't know, MDF or whatever on the exterior.
Oh yeah. So we basically called up our supplier, which we have already name dropped in this podcast. It's Liberty. We just asked them what their cheapest plywood was. And it is this, it's almost like a combination core. I don't quite remember what it's called. If I figure that out, we can add that or attach that to this podcast. But basically it's like a combination core plywood. But to what you said, Phil, the A and B sides are both MDF on the exterior. And I think there might even be a middle layer of MDF as well. And then the subsequent layers are, again, a combination of different types of plywood. But I started gluing up a couple of them the other day because I am building a larger router tabletop for that one that you built, just because I thought it would maybe serve a little bit better purpose in my shop if it were a little bigger.
Sure.
But yeah, that's something that we might try and use in some projects, or I would like to, because it does seem stable. I think Mark said it's maybe $40 a sheet, which, I mean, I don't know what you can buy for $40 a sheet that's worth using. At least not stuff that we get. That sanded plywood I paid more for, I know, and I think the MDF combination core stuff is nicer, frankly. It's a lot more flat, that's for sure.
Right.
But yeah, that again feeds into kind of what we're talking about. It's something I'd never really heard of, and really it just kind of came up out of a need. We spend a lot of money on plywood every year here, and outside of thinking about what's accessible for other people, we like to try and keep costs down too. It's not really sustainable to buy, sheets of plywood that are $120 a piece. And if we don't like paying that, people at home certainly won't like paying that either.
Yeah. Like it's
So
easy to say that you're paying for something with other people's money, but we still sit in on budget meetings and having expenses closely monitored and examined and stuff like that. So yeah, I'll take a photo of that plywood and put that on the show notes page, because I think it's really cool, because unlike regular MDF, it's not super heavy.
right.
And it also doesn't feel as floppy as a straight MDF panel either.
I think it would take a screw better as well because of its core contents. A lot of times with MDF, you're probably using not a drywall screw, but like a finer thread screw, where I think you'd use probably a coarser one on something like this, which is always welcomed.
Yeah.
And the fact that the AB sides are both the MDF, it's probably wonderful to paint. So, if you're not terribly attracted to how it looks in its final form, I think there's a lot of opportunity there for treatment. So,
yeah. Or you could veneer it too, I think would be nice, because you have a really consistent surface to veneer to.
100%. Not just edge banding tape, but actual hardwood edging. And, you could, again, like you said, veneer the top and bottom if you need to.
Yeah. Cool. All right. One last thing that I want to talk with you guys about, and this was based off of an experience that I had this last weekend. A friend of mine turned 50, and we went up to, a bunch of us, friends and family, went up to celebrate with him at his cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And when I got there, I saw that he had several vintage doors just kind of leaning against a wall. And I was wondering what the deal was with that. And it turns out that he wanted to replace some hollow core doors in the cabin with these reclaimed vintage doors that had been picked up from Marketplace or something. Having known that in advance, or reading the email about the party, I would have brought along a nicer set of tools, but I did not bring any tools. So we had what was available to us in a cabin that had been in the family since the early 50s, which means you can sort of imagine the kind of tools that were available to me. And my responsibility there was cutting new hinge mortises and adjusting latches on the door frames to account for the new old doors that were going in. I asked if he had a chisel, and he's like, oh yeah, I got a bunch of chisels downstairs. So we looked in the basement, and it turns out most of those chisels were cold chisels, which are harder to use in a woodworking application. But we did end up finding one sort of rusty chisel with a cracked wood handle that needed some work. So I found also a somewhat sketchy grinder, if it could be called such, and did as best I could to sharpen that tool, and ended up using it, and the hinges and everything turned out fantastic. And the power saw that we had to use it was a Black & Decker DeWalt radial arm saw, which we did cross-cutting on and ripping on. It was kind of a throwback experience, and I was just wondering if either of you two, because I know you're both friendly, helpful, and flexible on stuff like that, what kind of experiences you've had on, just using what you have available.
For me, it seems like even if I know what I'm getting to going in, and I'm like throwing everything in the toolbox and tool tote, and it's like these are all the possible tools that I can need, and even the stuff that I'm not thinking of, and I'll get there and it'd be like, would have been nice if I would have just brought like a glue gun or something. And I know exactly where it is in the shop, and it's like no matter how prepared I am and I think I'm being, it's like always missing something, and I got to make a run to the store or back to the shop, or just, I don't know. That's usually my experience of how it goes working on site.
Yeah.
yeah, I hardly ever have what I need to work on stuff. And I also have learned over the years of doing stuff for other people and even myself where I just know when to quit. So I think if I were confronted with a similar situation that you were, Phil, especially after driving all the way up to the Upper Peninsula, I would have said, I think I left my wallet in the car. I'll be right back. I also, I'm pretty good at just adjusting on the fly, but again, I like working efficiently. And if I feel like there's enough hurdles that I'm not making good use of my time, I usually will just, again, stop and reevaluate. And I would say my most recent project is we put in a half bath on our main floor, and we had a lot of the work contracted out, but a lot of the finishing work we've done, we put in the trim, the baseboards, the molding. We actually did the wallpaper. I have to install a sink, build a base, all these kind of extraneous things. Well, they're not extraneous, they're just extra things. But yeah, even at my own house, I don't have a shop at home. I do have tools. I have power tools that I don't have enough power to run, frankly, other than my chop saw. So usually it's my chop saw that's getting used and everything else is just a hand tool. And I have the luxury of living only less than 2 miles from work. And so when I forget something, I just get in my car and speed down Ingersoll and then get home and realize that I forgot something else too. So, but
I think the big lesson for me in it is that it's really easy and tempting sometimes to be distracted by the tools when it comes to woodworking, when in that situation for me it ended up being about accumulated skill over time to know, like, hey, these doors they're veneered, but inside is just pine stiles and rails. So adjusting or repositioning some hinge mortises with a chisel and a hammer isn't terribly difficult to do. And I was able to put a acceptable enough edge on there to be able to get what I needed to. So it was about that rather than having, some kind of blue steel Japanese chisel made from a ship anchor from the, Meiji dynasty or something like that on there. It just, and then, I grew up when I started woodworking with my dad. He had a Sears Craftsman radial arm saw, and going down there and seeing that radial arm saw was like stepping back in time. And I just, felt comfortable using the tool, knowing what it's capable of and what to do with it. And it worked out okay. So it was just kind of interesting because I think whether we're working here in a shop space or home, whatever our shop spaces are, there's still plenty of times when we're relying on either portable power tools or portable hand tools to do stuff. And it's not really about the tools or the shop.
right.
It's about what you can do with them.
Yeah. I kind of relish those situations sometimes. I think, sometimes I just really like depriving myself of things. But, when you're kind of confronted with those situations where you don't have your creature comforts and you kind of have to do this sort of deductive process, and that, how to do stuff, but it's like, how are you going to do what you know how to do with stuff you don't have? So
right.
That's part of your brain that almost goes into survival mode, but I don't know. I can definitely appreciate that situation.
Yeah. Cause I think there's a lot of woodworkers that end up doing home improvement projects. So even though, like John, you did that on your last house, there was a ton of projects that you were working on where even if you have shop space, there's a lot that you need to do on site or at that location in order to get it done. And you have to have that flexibility.
Yep, absolutely.
So I would love to hear anybody else's experience when you have had to go minimal, whether by choice or by the circumstances, and what you did to MacGyver your way out of that. You can send us an email, as always, woodsmith@woodsmith.com. Put a comment, question, or a smart remark on the YouTube channel and check it out there. I'll also put photos to a bunch of this stuff on our show notes page that you can check out at shopnotes.com/podcast. Special thanks to Grizzly for sponsoring today's episode. We rely on their tools and have frankly fallen in love with several of them. The spindle sander and the edge sander that are in the Woodsmith shop are unsung heroes of what we do around here. It's really easy to be distracted by a really cool planer or a table saw or jacked up bandsaw, but if you have a sweet operating spindle sander like that one that we have, that's big, cast iron, moves so smoothly, it's a wonder to behold. Check out their tools, grizzly.com. See you next week, everybody. Bye.